Hey everybody, we're ready to start chapter 6 called Population and Community Ecology. You should be on page 149 where it starts with New England forests come full circle. Okay, now this is an example of a case study about populations and community ecology. So let's take a look at what happened. Alright, so first we have our New England forests. Okay, so this is up in northeastern, and the kind of the mid-Atlantic coast of the United States. In 1620, the Pilgrims came and settled the forest. They had to clear out a bunch of forest area in order to not only build their homes in an area where they had some space, but to also build some farms. And they needed to cut down trees in order to make all the buildings, because at that time we didn't really have stuff like concrete. So everything that they constructed was made out of wood. Now by the year 1800, so a little like 180 years later, about 80% of the New England forest was gone. So the population had exploded so much that the 80% of the natural forest was now cleared, either for houses or agriculture. Now, by the time 1850 to 1950 rolled around, people started to move to the cities to work in factories. And what happened was that after all the people left and nobody was taking care, well, by taking care I mean cutting things down and building over on top of it, the old fields, like the old fields where they used to grow corn and things like that, went through succession and actually turned back into a forest. So it's been, 50, 60, 65 years since 1950, since it was kind of an abandoned area, and now it has turned it back into a forest. And so that process is called succession, and we're going to be talking about that at the end of chapter 6. Okay? So let's see what we got today. So we have nature exists at several levels of complexity. So if we zoom in on our first sticky note or second sticky note, we have the different levels of complexity. And over on figure 6.1, we have the different levels in a nice visual here. Let's take a look. Okay, so we have from an individual, which is our one rabbit, which is our unit of natural selection. Then we have population, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot. This chapter is the unit of evolution, like we talked about in chapter 5. Next we have community, so the interactions among species. That's another thing we're going to be talking about this chapter. We have ecosystems, which is the flow of energy and matter in and out of an ecosystem. That might be water, that might be our trophic levels, things like that we talked about in chapter 3. And then we have the biosphere, which is our global processes. Okay, so on my sticky note, I've kind of simplified that stuff for us. Okay, so I said that the individual is the unit of natural selection. We know through things like survival of the fittest that some organisms, some individuals are going to be successful in reproduction and some individuals are not. At the next level we have our populations, which is the unit of evolution, because remember, a single individual cannot evolve. It has to be a population that evolves, so we have the same species in an area at a time, which is a population. So they all have to be the same species and they all have to be in the same area at the same time for them to be considered a population. Then we have community, and that's going to be kind of like when we studied our biomes, so all populations in an area at a time. And then we have ecosystems, which is all biotic and abiotic parts of a location. So that might be mountain range, that might be a river. Biotic and abiotic, we talked about in chapter 3. And then we have the biosphere, which is all of Earth's ecosystems. Now I put little stars next to population and community because these are going to be our foci of this chapter, so how we're going to focus on this chapter. or what we're going to focus on in this chapter. Okay. So first, let's talk about population ecology. Okay, still on page 151. Population and ecology is the study of factors that cause populations, so POPs, okay, because populations is a hard word to write out a bunch of times, that causes populations to increase or decrease. Okay, so you talked about those a little bit today in class on your POGL. Okay, and so we talked about different things that might make a population increase or decrease. Okay, we're especially interested in endangered species like the California condor, and we're also especially interested in the invasive species like the emerald ash borer. Okay, and so that's a bug that's killing these ash trees. So we want to know about endangered species because we want to figure out how to use population ecology to save them, and we want to know about invasive species because we want to use population ecology to get rid of them. Okay, now figure 6.2 down here at the bottom, I've kind of simplified it into this for my sticky note. I know that immigration and births increase a population size, so they're going in, and emigration and deaths decrease the population size, so they're going out. Okay, that's another figure from your POGL today that we discussed in class. All right, so next we have population characteristics. All right, so you can be on page 152 right now, next to figure 6.3. All right, and we're going to have two different sticky notes here. So we have, let's see, 5 factors of population characteristics. Okay, so first is population size, denoted by the big N. You should remember that from our Shannon Wiener parking lot lab, which is the total number of individuals in an area at a given time. We care about this because it's going to be an indicator of a population nearing extinction, and sometimes we can also see it as nearing carrying capacity. Right, which is we're going to talk about that in a second. We talked about that in class today. The second one is going to be population density, so how many individuals per unit area. So how many, usually for people, we measure people in square miles, so that kind of gives us our population density. Okay, metropolitan areas like Denver is going to have a high population density. If we go east past Powers, that's going to have a low population density because there's not very many people and a lot of land. Okay, we want to know if populations are rare or abundant. Rare is there's not very many, and abundant is there's a lot. We want to make sure the food supply can support the population density. We want to make sure that we're having hunting and fishing management. So the Fish and Wildlife Services will actually increase the number of permits that they give out to hunters and fishermen when there's a high population density, and then they will decrease the number of permits people can have if there's a low population density. Okay, because we don't want to get rid of game. We don't want to get rid of the organisms that we use for hunting and fishing. Okay, next we have population distribution, and there's a nice figure right here. Figure 6.3 is a good one for population distribution. So we have random, like these tree species are definitely at random. We have uniform, lots of birds are this way, so there's like equal space between all their nests. And then we have clumped, where different species kind of go together in groups. Okay, the example here is going to be meerkats. So let's see what we're going to put on our sticky note. Okay, so random has no pattern. Like I said, trees in the wild. Uniform is going to have even space between each nest or organism, so birds nesting. You can also think of this as like a Christmas tree farm or an agricultural farm. They're going to have uniform distribution. Clumped are going to have large groups, so school of fish or anything that travels in a herd or a pack. Our fourth population characteristic is the sex ratio, so how many males to how many females. Most ecosystems are 50-50, but they're definitely going to change based on usually age and how many are able to reproduce. And speaking of age, we have number 5 is going to be our population age structure. So the number of individuals in each age group. We do this a lot for human populations. You did it today in your survivorship curve, so we want to know how many are too young to reproduce, how many are old enough to reproduce, and how many are too old to reproduce. Okay, we'll talk about that a lot as well in human populations in Chapter 7, and we'll do the age structure diagrams that you might be familiar with from biology. All right, now we're going to be at factors that influence population size. Okay, so first we started out with a case study. It's a paramecium experiment. So paramecium is a single-cell organism. Their question was, how does food supply control population growth? Okay, their first experiment, they had constant food over 16 days, and both of the species that this scientist, his name is Gauss, he tested both of the species reached a plateau, and I'll show you a graph of that in just a second. The second experiment, they doubled the food, and both species ended up reaching a plateau at the double population of the first experiment. So they had double the food, ended up supporting double the population. So that should make sense to you. Like if we have twice the food, we should have twice the population. So if we look at this graph, these graphs real quick, let's zoom out. If we look at these graphs on page 154, figure 6.4, okay, so under the low food conditions, the populations of both species grew rapidly at first and then reached a plateau, also known as our friend carrying capacity. With twice as much food, the populations of both species grew to twice as large, but still reached a plateau. Okay, so the carrying capacity is still there, it's just determined by how many resources are available for the organism. Okay, so let's talk about those factors. Okay, so first we have a couple of items of key population vocab, so things that are really important for us to understand is going to be the limiting resource is something that a population needs but occurs in quantities lower than a population needs to grow. Okay, so if the limiting resource decreases, so does the population size. A lot of time the limiting resource is something like phosphorus or nitrogen or anything that is kind of vital to organism survival. Oops, sorry about that. Next we have carrying capacity, which we can denote using the letter K, okay, which is a little bit different than K selected species. Okay, K also stands for carrying capacity, so don't get those confused. The carrying capacity is the limit of how many individuals the food supply or whatever the limiting factor is can sustain. Okay, so usually the carrying capacity is determined by the limiting factor. We usually have them at a dotted line, and it kind of helps us determine logistic growth. Okay. Now down here we have a couple of factors that influence population size. We have density dependent factors and density independent factors. Okay, so with density dependent factors, the effect on survival depends on the population size. Okay, so for example, the limiting resource, the more organisms you have, the faster that's going to run out. Okay, so that's why it's dependent on density. Okay, so like food is definitely going to depend on density. Water, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Space, absolutely. Okay, space is definitely a density dependent factor because you can have all the space in the world, but if you fill it up with 1 million people, okay, no one's going to have any space, and then we're going to get into the issues like sanitation and food and things like that. Density dependent factors are also determined by carrying capacity or can determine carrying capacity. Okay, so whatever the lowest limiting resource is going to determine carrying capacity. All right. Now, what about density independent factors? What about those factors that have nothing to do with the number of organisms there are? Okay, so this is going to be the effect on the survival is the same at any population size. So a hurricane's going to take out your population whether you have 2 individuals or you have 10,000. Okay, especially if you're like a mussel or a clam or something that can't really walk away. Floods, same thing. Fires, volcanic eruptions, it's going to kill all the trees, whether there's 5 or whether there's 65. Okay? Cold or winter can be a determining density independent factor. So overall, every individual has the same probability of survival. Okay? Over here, If you are better at getting food, you are going to survive more than your less capable counterparts, because food and resources like that are density dependent. Okay, so you have to compete more over here. In density independent, competition doesn't really matter because everyone's kind of screwed. All right, next page. We are on page 155 under where it says the exponential growth model. Okay, so this is an equation that we're going to use for the exponential growth model. As you notice, here's the E, which is a button on your calculator, which means you won't have to do it for the exam, but you'll probably have to do it a few times for me in class. Okay, so NT equals NOERT. So the NO stands for the current number of individuals, or the initial population, and T is the population over the set amount of time. Okay, so R is going to be growth rate and T is going to be time. Now, something special about R is that it's going to be the intrinsic growth rate, which means the maximum potential for growth under ideal conditions and unlimited resources. So the thing about exponential growth is that we are going to assume that there's unlimited resources. Now, there's not very often that actually happens, but using this formula for exponential growth, we're going to assume that everyone is in their favorite niche and that we have unlimited resources. Okay, so initial population, T is the final population. We have a J-shaped curve. We should know this. An example from the human world is going to be bank interest. You can put, $5 in the bank, and using interest, and over 100 years, you might have like $100 at the end, depending upon what your rate is. So when you put money in the bank, they'll tell you what your interest rate is, and that's how much they will give you every month. Okay, usually it's pretty low. Okay. All right, next let's go over to page 156, and now we're on logistic growth. Okay, so logistic growth is a thing because exponential growth is not possible in the real world. Okay, there's always something that's going to limit our growth. All right, so this is going to be our S-shaped curve. The carrying capacity is determined by the limiting resource. Okay, population size over here. Early growth is exponential. Growth begins to slow as you get closer and closer to the carrying capacity, and then eventually the growth falls to 0. Okay, so how much of a difference it's going to make? So this is fast growth, so when it increases fast here, when the slope is high, okay, that means the growth is fast. When it kind of goes straight up and down, that means growth has started to slow down, but we're still growing. And then once it levels out here, that means that the growth is at 0. Okay, so logistic growth, S-shaped curve, based on the limiting resource, gives us a carrying capacity. Okay, now there's a couple of variations on our logistic growth model. The first one is going to be overshoot and die-off, which is actually pretty common in a lot of species. So there's an increase in food or whatever the limiting resource is during mating season, which makes there be an increase in babies. Okay, so the more food during mating season means there's more energy and stuff to make babies, so there's more babies come spring. But then in the spring, if there's not enough food to support all those new babies, you're going to have an increase in deaths. Okay, so this is going to be kind of an oscillation. So the population size is increasing at first. It goes past the carrying capacity because for some reason that year there's a bunch of food, and then that's called overshoot. So when it goes above the carrying capacity, that's called overshoot. Then when it goes down below the carrying capacity, it's called die-off. Okay, so there was probably too many deer or something in an area, and the increase in food had to temporarily increase the carrying capacity, but then, maybe there's not a great crop in the spring and there's too many babies, and so a few of the weaker animals are going to have to die off. Okay, then when there's a lower population, the trees can grow back a little bit, and then we can increase up, not too much, then it goes down, increasing down. Okay, it eventually gets to oscillations eventually lead to carrying capacity. And you can kind of estimate by looking at this graph, even if we didn't have the dotted line, you could kind of estimate where the carrying capacity was. And eventually the population will probably hit it, but you can never really predict how much is going to grow as far as vegetation in any one year. So any herbivore population is going to look like this. Okay? All right, next we have predator-prey. Okay, our predator-prey relationship. The example that we use here is the lynx and the Arctic hare. Okay, I did the lynx in green and the hare in blue. Okay, so we can kind of see like they're kind of cause and effect to one another. Okay, so the hare population goes up, and since there's more hares to feed more lynx, okay, a lynx is a large cat species, the lynx population goes up as well. But then if there's too many lynx, then there's not enough hares to feed all of them, and they keep decreasing, and then the lynx population decreases. Okay, so as the lynx population decreases, the hare population increases, and then the lynx population increases as a result of the hare population increases, but then the hare population goes down. Okay, so it oscillates about a bajillion times. Okay, so due to food predator-prey relationships, it's going to oscillate and oscillate and oscillate some more until they can kind of even out. Okay, so let's take a look at this figure here. Figure 6.10 is a really good explanation, I think. So hares increase in number when their food is abundant, and then there are few lynx to prey on them. Okay, then we have with more hares to eat, the lynx reproduce more and increase in number. So more lynx. Then if we have more, with an increase in number of hares, the hare's food supply declines and the hare population dies off. As hares become less abundant, the lynx population dies off. With less predation and more food, the hare population increases, and the cycle repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. Okay? So predator-prey, they kind of have a cause and effect relationship with each other. Okay? All right, next we have reproductive strategies and survivorship curves. Okay, so there are two kinds of species where we can kind of categorize species into two groups. One are K-selective species and the other is R-selective species. We're on page 159. K-selective species are large. They achieve sexual maturity late in life. They have very few offspring, and they have high parental care. So our examples for this are going to be humans and elephants. From a conservation standpoint, they're kind of a challenge to protect because they grow so slowly. Okay, so things like pandas, it's really hard for us to help them grow because, or help their population grow because they take, a bajillion years to get to reproductive age, and then they have like 1 or 2 babies. Okay, so it's hard to increase a population like that when it takes so long. Okay, same with elephants, same with rhinos. Okay, now our selected species are going to be kind of the opposite of that. They're small usually. They achieve early maturity, so like flies, it's a couple days and then you're ready to go. They have numerous offspring, so things like plants and fish. They have little to no parental care. So our examples here are going to be a mouse, fish, bugs, plants. Okay. Now what you need to understand is that most species aren't exclusive to one type. Most species have like a few characteristics of K, a few characteristics of R, but some of them fit in really nicely. So don't think that, I think the examples that the book uses, let's see. So, for example, tuna and redwood trees are both long-lived species that take a long time to reach reproductive maturity. Once they do, however, they produce millions of small offspring that receive no parental care. Okay, so they're large, they late maturity, but then they also have no parental care and many offspring, so they have characteristics of both. Okay, so don't think that it has to be this and it has to be this in order for it to be K or R. It's just a matter of which one is the most. Okay. Next we have our survivorship curves, which you guys talked about in class today. So we have type 1, type 2, type 3. Type 1 is going to have a lot of survivors until late in life, and then they're going to die off. Type 2 is going to have kind of an equal probability of survival through their whole lifespan. So it doesn't really matter if they're newborns or if they're old, they have the same probability of death. And then type 3 is going to be a lot born, but not very many surviving into reproductive age and old age. Okay? So lots survive until old age, not very many survive until old age, and then equal numbers survive into old age. Okay? Now, a few new ideas from the lecture today are most K-selected species are type 1. Okay, so whales, humans, elephants. And most R-selected species are type 3. So dandelions, insects, fish, things like that are going to be type 3. Okay? Last sticky note of the day is metapopulations, so page 160. Metapopulations are populations that are spatially distinct but connect through random movement of individuals. So these are kind of lone populations that have the occasional transfer of individuals. A lot of times we think of large cats for this. So an example might be a lion, or my example here is a cougar. So cougars live in the mountains, and in a lot of places the cougars that live on different mountains kind of have distinct populations. Okay, in my example we have, like, for example, a desert can separate two mountain populations that sometimes mix individuals. So this cougar over here in our photo, he's just running around, going to these different mountain populations, okay, increasing genetic diversity and randomly mating with the people over here, and then going back to my original population, then going over visit over here. Okay, so all of his tracks here, these are called corridors, where he can kind of mix, so where he can survive long enough to get from one population to the other. Okay, if the habitat is good enough for him in between, that's called a corridor. Okay, so you can think of a corridor like a road. Okay, and that's what I said over here. I said through corridors like a road. Now, why would we want metapopulations? Why would we want individuals going from one population to another? First reason is genetic variation. We want to have a high enough genetic variation so that, a disease doesn't wipe us out, kind of like the bananas. Okay, so if we have random individuals coming and going, that's going to increase our genetic variation. Okay, and then the other example is going to be the vulnerability to density independent factors decreases, because if you have enough corridors, like let's say it gets really cold on one mountain, if we have enough corridors or little roads that the cougars can go from one mountain to another, maybe the other one isn't as cold, or maybe it's not getting as much snow, or whatever the reason, it can decrease the vulnerability to density independent factors. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say DI. All right, tomorrow be ready for a quiz, and we'll start on competition.